Thank you for coming. My name is Cheri Daschle. I was born and raised in Steamboat. We live south of town on what was then known as the Mesa. I think people call it South Valley now. That's because there's more money out there now than there was when I grew up. My childhood home was at the base of Rabbit Ears Pass. Any history I was connected with really had to do more with the South Valley than with North Route. So the only thing I knew was I'd heard of Mad Creek. We used to go to Steamboat Lake now and then and play. I knew where the trailhead was. I'd heard about rattlesnakes in the area. But like Candace said, in 2018, Donna Heinzie Davis came to the Dreaded Pioneers, brought those photos, artifacts, and the story of the Mad Creek Guest Ranch. And after hiking this, and because many of you have hiked it, it's remote. I mean, it is up there. So to think of a full-on guest ranch being in that area was really intriguing to us. So the Mad Creek stories, I like outlines. So the Mad Creek stories' primary characters are Harry Ratliff, who was the Mad Creek homesteader. The Ives family, in 1919, one of the Ives family bought the property up there, and then it went from Courtney Ives from 1919 to 1923 to his brother, Dr. George, and Vivian Ives, and then after that, Fred and Corinne Lucille Ives, and then the Hindsie family. Like we said, the Hindsie family was where we started our story, was somebody who came in and was telling us about the history of this place. The other connection was, and I'll tell you as we go, that we also got to meet the son, one of the sons of Fred and Corinne Ives, and did an on-site tour, jeeping up in the area with one of the Ives descendants as well. So most of you are familiar with this, but the Forest Service Trail, to get to the Mad Creek area, you go 5.5 miles up 129 or up Elk River Road, and then just off that is the Mad Creek Trailhead. And you can tell where the barn is from the Mad Creek Trailhead to the barn area is about 2 miles. And then, like Candace said, where they hiked, the Hindsie Homestead is way the heck and gone up on this other side, up at the hillside. And so it's also very remote. So leaving the trailhead parking lot, when we do our hikes, the hike to the Mad Creek barn is about 2 miles. Mad Creek itself used to be called the Mad Creek Canyon Road, and it hikes, like I said, the hike to the barn is about 2 miles. Mad Creek itself was reportedly named in 1877, reportedly, like I said, after a traveler nearly drowned in the stream and his horse was beat to death on the rocks. I know, sad story. Or maybe it was just madly tumbling water. You know how legends are. The trail to the Mad Creek barn was called Mad Creek Canyon Road, and now that hiking trail, if you've been on it, is you can see that a car could be on there at that point in the 20s. It's now about half that wide. That's what it looked like in the winter, not exactly what you would call a road. This is part of what it looks like now. You can tell that the trail is maybe just footpath wide, but this is a lot of the work that the Ives family did with the rocks that they put in there. And when you're hiking it, definitely notice those rocks because it's amazing for back in the early 1900s what they did on that road. So Ron Ives was the 4th generation Ives family member that we got to meet, and he said they called this their ranch road. And they did a lot of work on that road. So this is what the barn looks like today, all refurbished and restored. From 1903 to 1907, the Mad Creek Canyon Road was used to access the homestead of our first character, and he was a character, James Harry Ratliff. He was born in 1879 and died in 1956. Ratliff was the son of Colorado pioneers and one of the first cattle ranchers in that area of Routt County. He was the one who built this barn in 1906. United States Congress had just passed the Forest Reserve Act of 1891, authorizing the president to designate public lands into what was called forest reserves. President Roosevelt, Theodore Roosevelt, transferred their management to the brand new U.S. Forest Service. In 1905, President Roosevelt established the Park Range Forest Service Reserve, which is now called the Routt National Forest. Ratliff's ranch was located entirely in the boundaries of the reserve. He used timber from nearby land building on his property, and he was told to stop that. This is a picture of him during Rabbit Ears Pass construction. We think that's him off to the side of the wagon. Fun enough picture of old Rabbit Ears. So he had a friend named Jack Ellis, and Jack Ellis was one of the first forest guards or first forest rangers. So Harry kept a journal, Harry Ratliff kept a journal, and he told this story. It's almost there. And this is the way he told the story in his journal about his first connection with the Forest Service. He said, "I learned that Jack Ellis was appointed forest guard. Jack was at one time a partner of mine, and at this time was running about 5,000 steers. Jack was a pretty good cowman. He looked after his business pretty well. Anyway, Jack came over to see me at my ranch on Mad Creek." I have another picture of Harry Ratliff you have to see here. So, he's talking about Jack Ellis and their friends. Jack Ellis comes over to the ranch, to the Mad Creek Ranch. He brought his wife and family along. It was in the spring and the snow was just melting. Jack's wife and my wife were good friends, and so were Jack and I. The women folks went into the house, and Jack and I went out to the barn. I had during the winter cut 100 or more logs from dry timber with which to build the new barn. I had about 500 poles cut for corrals. Logs and poles were piled near the barn. We sat down and Jack said, "Where'd you get those logs and poles?" I pointed to the east and I said, "Up on the hill." He said, "Hell, you can't do that, Harry." I answered, "The hell I can't, I've done it." Wild West, right? We're all independent out here. He said, "It's against the law." I said, "What law?" "It's the law of the reservation." "I can't allow you to do that." I said, "Why?" He said, "Because it's unlawful to cut timber without a permit now." I asked him how to get a permit, and he said, "Come to me. All you have to do is ask me, and I'll give it to you for free." I answered, nearly as I recall, "You mean I have to hunt you up every time I want to cut a stick of timber?" And he said, "No, take a permit out enough to do you for several months at a time." I said, "But what if you're not around?" He said, "Well, you can wait till you find me." I didn't feel good about this. My cattle were grazing on the bare meadow, and Jack said, "How many cattle have you, Harry?" I replied I had about 75 or 100 head and some horses. He said, "You better get a permit for them." I said, "Do you mean I have to have a permit for my cattle, my horses, my corral poles, my house logs, my firewood, and I have to hunt you up to find that too?" Jack said, "Damn it, I didn't make this law, but it is what it is and you have to do it." I said, "Jack, you take your little permit for sticks, stumps, steers, and get the hell off my ranch." Jack went and we were both mad. Another source said later that Ellis resigned the post, get this, because of a conflict arising from his practice of grazing his own cattle on the forest reserve without a permit. Ironically, at a meeting Ratliff failed to attend, he was nominated to become the next Forest Service representative, a position he himself held until 1914. This is what he wrote in his journals about being a forest reserve person or a forest ranger. "I entered the Forest Service ignorant of its purpose and opposed to its policy. I didn't like it or anything it represented. My personal interests were located and were a part of the identical region in which I served. I took the job of forest guard. I furnished my own horses, paid my own expenses. I left my wife to run the ranch and I started to ride. I had about 24 arguments a day, lost about half of them. These were stormy days for the new forest guard because this was when all the open cattle range was becoming fenced. There were sheep issues and cattle issues, and there were also government issues where you did have to start being managed and not just free to roam around. But Mr. Ratliff was conscientious in his service as the first forest supervisor of the Routt National Forest. He had to deal with cattle barons, homestead owners, cattle ranchers, outlaws in Browns Park to the west, and the federal government itself. But under his leadership, they conducted the first cattle census, and they allowed sheep to use the non-used land. He was also forest supervisor during when they built Rabbit Ears Road, it was called at the time, which we know as Rabbit Ears Pass. He was serving as Forest Service supervisor then, and also during the Hans Peak Fire Tower being built. And we know that's been rebuilt, restored, and looks a whole lot better than that now. So this is what the Mad Creek barn looked like back in the day. This one was taken in the 20s. So the barn that you saw the picture of, let me go back a little bit here, used to have a lean-to on it and some more outbuildings. So you can see the lean-to where they stored grain and some other little sheds and outbuildings. Ratliff retired in 1914 and moved to Utah. According to his obituary, during his life he had been acquainted with such wild figures as Butch Cassidy and Tom Horn. So he really had a Wild West kind of job out there. So in the summer of 2021, we were privileged to meet Ron Ives, a relative of the next group of characters, the relative of the owners of the ranch, and take a tour. Ron said he wasn't sure when the house near the barn was originally built, and there is a picture. This isn't the original, or this isn't the house that still stands. There's still a foundation up there, and these were prior to that, probably in the early 1900s. But he said when he lived there, the barn was there and there were several outbuildings, and he and his parents lived in the little house that I'll show you a picture of later. He remembered there was a gas generator in the basement hooked to a row of batteries to store electricity in the house. And he said you could just flip a switch for power and light. Now, of course, we take that for granted, but that was kind of nice that he could get up in the middle of the night and flip a switch. And he said that the water for the house was supplied by a spring, and that the lean-to portion of that barn was where grain was stored. So meanwhile, on to the Ives family. These are some of the cabins that they built. This one I think was one of the Ives family homes, the larger one. And you know, the stringer of fish that she's got there. A lot of nice ivy on these. The cabin on your left was taken a couple of years ago. That's one of the cabins that was a guest cabin that was still standing. This is a picture we took summer before last. And we took it because it's probably not going to last much longer. There's still 3 cabins up there. On the trail from the Mad Creek barn toward the bridge crossing to Mad Creek, you can still see the remains of 3 of the guest cabins. There were probably 6 or 7. And then across the creek from that was this lodge. And there's not a stick or stone of this left anymore. So if you're down at the creek and you look up on the plateau, this is where we think, by looking at the mountains behind them, that this is where the lodge sat. And the building behind it we thought was a bathhouse, but Ron Ives said he thought it was a mess house. And it was also like a kitchen, an outdoor kitchen. So it's quite the lodge. There's a picture of the inside of the lodge. So meals for guests were served in this lodge. So that it operated from at least the years of 1928 to 1951 as the Mad Creek Guest Ranch or Dude Ranch, which was quite a while. The lodge advertised that meals consisting of cream, butter, eggs, chicken, and vegetables were grown right there on the ranch property. It was advertised to have a large stone fireplace, which we see in this picture. I think that's Dr. George himself there with a couple of his little girls. So when we tell the kids about this property and how exciting this is to have this remote ranch back here, this great big guest lodge, and this is what the entertainment was at the time, kids of course would yawn. The lodge was advertised to have a large stone fireplace with a piano and a radio for the pleasure of the guests who vacationed there. There were tennis courts on the property, as well as horses for horseback riding. In the fall, there were guided horseback trips for hunters, and they also advertised world-class fishing opportunities. Fred Ives' son Ron said he remembered that the ranch originally encompassed 1,375 acres and may have even included a dance hall closer down to Mad Creek Village. He remembered seeing a huge rack of horns over the fireplace, which could be what we're seeing in the picture, so wide and so big that the tips extended into the ceiling of the building. So, fairly large. He recalled that there were 6 or 7 cabins in the guest ranch, 2 located down near the trailhead, and the larger one, which we don't have a picture of, but if you hike, it's real easy to find. If you look at the bridge and you go down to the left, it's the very first cabin you see, and he thought that was a bathhouse. And it still has a standing metal stove, and it has a cement floor, so it might have been a bathhouse. That's one of the porch on the Mad Creek Ranch Lodge in the 30s. Later. He remembered there was a gas generator in the basement hooked to a row of batteries to store electricity in the house. And he said you could just flip a switch for power and light. Now, of course, we take that for granted, but that was kind of nice that he could get up in the middle of the night and flip a switch. And he said that the water for the house was supplied by a spring, and that the lean-to portion of that barn was where grain was stored. So meanwhile, on to the Ives family. These are some of the cabins that they built. This one, I think, was one of the Ives family homes, the larger one. And, you know, the stringer of fish that she's got there. A lot of nice ivy on these. The cabin on your left was taken a couple of years ago. That's one of the cabins that was a guest cabin that was still standing. This is a picture we took summer before last. And we took it because it's probably not going to last much longer. There's still 3 cabins up there. On the trail from the Mad Creek barn toward the bridge crossing to Mad Creek, you can still see the remains of 3 of the guest cabins. There were probably 6 or 7. And then across the creek from that was this lodge. And there's not a stick or stone of this left anymore. So if you're down at the creek and you look up on the plateau, this is where we think, by looking at the mountains behind them, that this is where the lodge sat. And the building behind it we thought was a bathhouse, but Ron Ives said he thought it was a mess house. And it was also like a kitchen, an outdoor kitchen. So it's quite the lodge. There's a picture of the inside of the lodge. So meals for guests were served in this lodge. So that it operated from at least the years of 1928 to 1951 as the Mad Creek Guest Ranch or Dude Ranch, which was quite a while. The lodge advertised that meals consisting of cream, butter, eggs, chicken, and vegetables were grown right there on the ranch property. It was advertised to have a large stone fireplace, which we see in this picture. I think that's Dr. George himself there with a couple of his little girls. So when we tell the kids about this property and how exciting this is to have this remote ranch back here, this great big guest lodge, and this is what the entertainment was at the time, kids of course would yawn. The lodge was advertised to have a large stone fireplace with a piano and a radio for the pleasure of the guests who vacationed there. There were tennis courts on the property, as well as horses for horseback riding. In the fall, there were guided horseback trips for hunters, and they also advertised world-class fishing opportunities. Fred Ives' son Ron said he remembered that the ranch originally encompassed 1,375 acres and may have even included a dance hall closer down to Mad Creek Village. He remembered seeing a huge rack of horns over the fireplace, which could be what we're seeing in the picture, so wide and so big that the tips extended into the ceiling of the building. So, fairly large. He recalled that there were 6 or 7 cabins in the guest ranch, 2 located down near the trailhead, and the larger one, which we don't have a picture of, but if you hike, it's real easy to find. If you look at the bridge and you go down to the left, it's the very first cabin you see, and he thought that was a bathhouse. And it still has a standing metal stove, and it has a cement floor, so it might have been a bathhouse. That's one of the porch on the Mad Creek Ranch Lodge in the 30s. I think that's the doctor back there smoking his pipe. So let me read before we get to this picture to go back and tell you a couple more stories. So during this time when it was a guest ranch, the pilot did a fair amount of advertising for this big venture. So Dr. George Ives literally was a physician from St. Louis, Missouri, and he and his brother Courtney hoped to engage in the fur business. So they would go on to raise foxes, minks, and fur animals. At the time of the sale of the ranch from one brother to the other, they had 20 foxes, and we're still purchasing more foxes to raise back up there. In 1924, Courtney Ives completed the road up the Mad Creek Canyon and said it will now be wide enough for sleds to come up. And next year they hope to have autos be able to come up, because before that it had been horseback and pulled wagons. And in 1924 it said that Mr. Ives had erected a number of neat log cottages and wants to make the ranch a popular resort for Eastern tourists. So in some of the printouts that we have, you can see guests that were listed in the 30s, and some did come from St. Louis. I don't remember if they came from much farther. Most of the guests came from Denver area, because you could ride the train up and you could, come by automobile at some point in the 20s and 30s when you could make it over at Rabbit Ears Road. And in 1927, just before they opened, there were ads going out like to CSU, what's now CSU, which was now the Ag College at the time, and it said that it was a complete outdoor education and character building program for the school, for boys. It was a boys' school. During the same time, Courtney Ives also had a creamery called the Purity Creamery in Steamboat Springs. And that was a profitable business, apparently as far back as 1919 and maybe up as far as 1977. They also owned land in Oak Creek, and his wife, Mrs. Courtney Ives, was touted as the manager and a qualified cook of best quality food at the Columbine Cafe in Steamboat Springs. So they were well connected with the whole area. So some of the articles, I think the camp opened for their first group of boys in the summer of 1929. Leading up to that, they first opened up for a group of 25 boys, and the State Ag College said that there's nothing better for any boy than a summer at the Mad Creek Ranch. And by 1929, they were advertising that Lewis Klumker, Northwestern Colorado pioneer, would be the instructor that summer for taxidermy. So that would be one of the lessons you could learn as a camper up there. In summer of 1929, too, they were building a new cabin. They added the bathhouse and a store and a filling station. And they were bringing people up from Texas, so it wasn't so much east as it was west. But they also had a swimming instructor that year. Now, those of you who have hiked that, where do you suppose they swam? I know, that's what I thought. Like, okay, if you go by the bridge, you could maybe get in the water up to here and, maybe get two people across, but I don't know if that means the Mad Creek was much wilder or deeper at the time. So in 1929 was the Older Boys Conference. This is, Candace and I love this ad. This is one of my favorite ads from 1930. High up in the Colorado mountains and nestled in a beautiful valley, checkered with hay and grain fields, is a spot that is truly the vacationist's paradise. Mad Creek Ranch, the only privately owned land on the whole stretch of Mad Creek. One of the best, if not actually the best, fishing stream in the Route National Forest. Evenings at the ranch are perhaps the most enjoyable of all. Also, this is easier for adults to get than kids. They're probably thinking, yeah, this is great. It is then that we gather around the big stone fireplace and pop corn, toast marshmallows, and spin yarns about those big speckled fellows that we didn't quite land. Impromptu programs of music and dramatics are part of the boys' regular schedule. In 1930, they built a brand new house for the Ives family to live in, and at some point it burned down. And then they rebuilt it. By 1931, they were saying that the ranch comprises 700 acres of wooded hills and open spaces and is the ideal place to spend the summer season. At the time of Dr. George Ives' death in 1948, he was listed as owning much property on Mad Creek and the adjoining ranch on Hot Springs Creek. So when you go back to that map that I showed you, when you come back around the other side where we're going to talk about the Hindsie Homestead, it comes out at the Hot Springs Trail, pretty close to the Hot Springs Trail. So this is our next guy. This is Robert Heinzie. And he's standing in front of what we think was either the bathhouse or the mess hall. And he and his family homesteaded on up the road from there. This is his wife and Robert and their first two little kids. I think this would be Aurelia and Cornelius. So the Hindsie Road on the other side of Mad Creek could be more easily navigated. I'll show you that road, first chance I get here. Oh, just when you think you have your pictures all in a row, you know? You have to imagine the road. The road on the other side was wide enough for a wagon and a team. It's a nice big road. Right now it's pretty much clay and it's all soft and gushy. But it was definitely more of a road than a jeep trail like the other side. So the Heinzie family were homesteaders above Mad Creek from 1915 to 1944. Robert Conrad Heinzie came to Steamboat Springs from the Denver Boulder area in 1913. He brought his Stanley Steamer and used it to deliver mail from Steamboat to Craig and back. And at that time, that was the 5th car in Steamboat. So he and his wife, Elizabeth Wonderly Heinzie, wintered in Denver, awaiting the birth of their next baby. And when that baby was born, then they moved up here in the spring of 1913. They rented a house in Steamboat Springs, and he hauled mail from Steamboat to Craig and back. And at that time, not too long before that, the rails had been laid in Routt County, and soon the train was delivering the mail instead, so that didn't work by car for much longer. He wrote that he had to give that up. He worked with 13 horse camps, he called them, between Steamboat and Craig. He said it was no good for an auto, especially when it got wet. He said, I've seen 9 feet of snow on the level over there. So obviously you're not driving a car through 9 feet of snow. He traded his Stanley Steamer, and that is a picture of him on his steamer. Not sure where they took that, it's a great picture. He traded that for real estate, and in 1950 he got his hands on 360 acres, and soon another 80 acres at Mad Creek. At one time, the Heinzies had 200 cattle on their ranch and rented another ranch to produce hay. They had a third child, little Mary, and they either went 5 miles to the Middle Elk School or to the Mad Creek School. We're not sure which. I read something that Bill May wrote. He's the local historian and cowboy poet, and he said that he thought it was the Middle Elk School. But at times it would be 35 to 40 degrees below zero when they're riding their horses to school. So when Donna came and told us some of her memories, this is a picture of the Hindsie Homestead in 1915. It's actually a pretty nice house. That's later in the 1940s. That's probably Robert with the coveralls on. Might be his wife in the flowered dress. Thank you. I love that. That's why I want a historian on here too. This is what's left of the Hindsie Homestead place that took these guys the 5-6 hour hike to get to and not found again. And I did find something that Bill May also said about, they called it Hindsie's point of view from up there. And they called it, we would call it, your view or your, but he called it, when you go up there, you get a new point of view. That's what he said. So the Hindsie family grew or hunted most of their food. Meals consisted of eggs, milk, chicken, and bear, deer and elk. They also had rhubarb and raspberries growing nearby. They canned a lot of food for the long winters. Grandpa Robert related that at that time, at least once, he had to dig a tunnel to get into their home. Donna's dad, Cornelius, which was Robert's son, had a horse named Rooster who couldn't be ridden by most people. But for some reason, he let Cornelius, or Corky, ride him. One late afternoon, it was getting dusky, and he decided to just jump on that horse and let it run. And someone had put up a barbed wire fence gate in the dark, and he didn't see it. So he and his horse hit the gate, tumbled over, both of them got up and were fine and went on home. So these are stories that Donna told us in her memories. One evening, her grandpa Robert was home alone. The family wasn't home. He was chopping wood, and he chopped right down through his thumb. He had to milk his cows, so the only thing he could do was dip his hand in that barrel of turpentine, wrap it up with rags, milk the cows, and then go to the doctor the next day, which entailed a horseback or wagon ride back down the Steamboat the following day. There's plenty of bear stories about this family too. Donna recalls her grandpa having a pet bear outside on a cable. Grandpa Robert said he had to once kill a female bear who killed one of their pigs. And then sometimes when they would get bear cubs, I don't know if that's because they killed the mom, they would take them on the train and donate them to Ellis Gardens Amusement Park in Denver. But they also trapped bears more than once, either for their own meat. Anybody out there had bear meat lately? Yeah. Well, I have once. It was greasy. Or they would take it to the meat market in Steamboat Springs, or to donate for Denver. There was a solar eclipse when the family lived there. That day, Elizabeth and her little kids were out in the garden, and as the sky grew dark, she knew that the world was coming to an end. So she sat there with her children and just gave up on life, and then the sun came back out and they went on with their lives. Elizabeth was known to be a sculptor with some talent. She created sculptures of presidents and other subjects. One year they attempted to haul her artwork in a wagon to the county fair, but all the sculptures were broken on the way. So that was not something that survived. Granddaughter Donna said it was a hard life up here. It was difficult, but I think they had a good life. It was still very much at that time a life for hardy pioneers. Mad Creek Ranch continued on as a guest ranch. Robert and Elizabeth's son Cornelius and daughter Mary managed the ranch for several years during the Great Depression. So the pilot reported in 1935 that Mad Creek Ranch is now ready for summer patrons. Everything is lovely after a scrimmage with scrub brush, paint, soap, and general repair work. The road is in good condition to the camp. It's been graded the entire length and hand raked until it's as smooth as a table. Too bad they're not around now. We can smooth that right out. Dr. George Ives, owner of the Mad Creek Ranch, lives in St. Louis, Missouri, but his heart is in Routt County, and he spares no expense to keep the place improved. That fall they had hunters, and they did hunt trips. And then in 1936 and 37, there were warnings in the paper for the public not to use Mad Creek Ranch Road as a thoroughfare to drive stock or access lakes. And so I think that was pretty much the end of, they just wanted the ranch to be their place. They didn't want regular, everyday folks just coming through, which makes sense. And then Candace indicated that we have a sad tale. So I do have a printout of this article that was in the paper. So Heinzie's lived up there from, I think I said 1915 to 1944. This is what Robert, these guys all wrote journals, which is a great thing. In his journals, Robert wrote about the death of his wife Elizabeth in 1936. My wife was an administrator of a group of houses, property on her mother's side. Mrs. Hindsie had to make a trip to Denver on this date, February 5th, 1936. We were having a real winter. You guys live here, you know what a real winter looks like, right? With plenty of cold weather and snow, clear into May and June. But this is February. Mrs. Heinze was due to go to Denver on the train that morning. It was 40 below. She made the trip to Steamboat Springs with me, and I got there just as the train steamed into the depot. I know I was white with frost, and I pushed her into the depot real quick so I could get away, as my team did not like that train. I bade Mother goodbye, and that was the last time I ever saw her alive. This is how fast things happen. We had old friends still at Broomfield who wanted her to come out to stay overnight with them. She got in Denver at 6 o'clock and caught a bus right out to Broomfield. It was dark when the bus let her off at their friends, the Mets gate, a mile east of Broomfield. One of those crazy drivers came along going in the opposite direction at 100 miles an hour. That was his impression. Mother stepped in his path and he threw her 200 feet. She was the same as dead then. There were a boy and a girl at this ranch who saw the wreck. The girl was Ella Metz, and when she looked at Mrs. Heinzie lying on the pavement, she ran up to the house screaming it was Mrs. Heinzie. Her parents took her to the hospital, but Mrs. Metz said she was the same as dead when they got her to Colorado General Hospital. So, my dear readers, this is how fast things can happen. I had no phone on the ranch, but word had to get to me, so the best the phone company could do was to get a hold of Mr. Fred May, which was Bill May's father, who was homesick with the flu. He got out of bed, and Mr. May walked, instead of taking a horse, taking time to harness up the horse and everything, he walked up to the Hindsie place, which, if you get a chance to see that road in the dark with a lantern, walking up there in the winter with the flu, carrying a lantern at 10 o'clock at night. Just put yourself in my place. Just that morning I had put that woman on the train as well as I ever saw her, and at 10 o'clock that night, I'll use his words, she was a corpse. I couldn't say that. That's a hard thing to say. This might make you think. So his oldest daughter was married, and after they were done, the two oldest kids, after they managed the ranch for a while, his oldest daughter got married and lived in Empire. And at that time, somehow somebody in Denver reached her and her husband, and they got to the hospital when Mrs. Heinzie passed on. But he was home with 150 head of cattle. His son was a teenager. He had to get to Denver the next day, so his good neighbor helped feed the cattle. And they got somebody to help with the feeding. This friend, Alexander McDermott, took Mary and I to Steamboat to catch the train. What a good man that was that got us to Steamboat. He turned to me and asked how I was financially fixed. I thanked him, and I said, as it happened, I had money. No one thinks of these killings when it doesn't happen to be one of theirs. It's just another accident. As for myself, I will never get over it and be in my place and think how you would feel. So afterwards, when we do questions and things, there is a whole article from the pilot of a nice article about this lady who died. And they say that she had been a resident of Routt County for many years and helped develop the ranch at the Mad Creek area. A frequent visitor in Steamboat, she met many friends and had a pleasant word for everyone. The social activities of her community always gave her pleasure, and her hospitality was outstanding. So this is the rest of Robert's journals. And then we'll move to the 60s for just a couple of minutes. Robert stayed on at the remote ranch for about 9 more years as the 3 children grew to adulthood. His oldest daughter, Aurelia, taught school above Hayden for a little while. She married and moved to Empire. Mary also moved to Empire and then worked in the Navy in D.C. during World War II. Cornelius and Mary managed the guest ranch for a couple more years. And then in Robert's journal he wrote, following the death of my wife, I got to figuring and I shipped 4 carloads of cattle, cut my herd down to 50 head, and here I went. It took in a way all the best that was ever in me, and I didn't give a whoop anymore. I carried on for a period of 11 years by myself and didn't get anywhere anymore. I ran my health down batching on that place. I sold the ranch in 1944 during World War II. The place had quite a drawback as it was on a high mesa. I don't know if you can tell from, well, you can tell from what's left of it, where it is and how high up it is. It was a mile from the river up a pretty stiff grade. I had worked 15 years with the commissioners to put a road through my place for hot springs, but with the war efforts taking priority, the road never happened. In the spring of 1944, I didn't feel too well, and Dr. George Ives was over to see me. He made me an offer, so I sold him the ranch. I shipped my furnishings and left for Denver. So he eventually lives with his son Cornelius in Georgetown. In 1951, we'll go on to what it looks like in the 50s and 60s. So this is the barn. It still has a piece of the lean-to left, and the little house to the left was the original Ives family house, but had been rebuilt by then, at least once or twice. Once because it burned, and then once probably because it needed to be updated. So in 1951, Mr. and Mrs. Boyd Bear of Otis, California purchased the lease on the Mad Creek cabins and on the ranch from Fred Ives. They were going to operate the cabins through the summer season, but you could never find any evidence that they actually did that. It sounds like in the 60s, the early 50s and 60s, it was just done. They were done being a guest ranch. Courtney Ives passed away in 57. George Ives' son, Fred, and wife Lucille sold the ranch to Donald and Nancy Holson in 1963. And the Forest Service purchased the land in 1979. So the Ives family was done with that, and now the Holsons have it. So they bought what they said was the 1,600-acre Mad Creek Ranch in 1963 from the Ives. They had moved from Phoenix. And they moved into the red house by the bridge on County Road 129. And I think when you take off from the Hindsie side, coming off 129, that red stone house is still there. I don't remember if it's still red, but the stone house is still there. In 1965, Holsons moved into the house that they built, I think it's this house, on the meadow above the red house. They added another metal building nearby. And their place included the Heinzie Homestead, the Mad Creek Valley, the mouth of Mad Creek Canyon, and the Spring Creek area. So they used the foundation of the old house to build that house, which doesn't look very new anymore. They said when they bought the ranch, the old lodge in the field on the plateau above the bridge was still standing and was occasionally used by sheep herders. They rented the ranch each summer to the owner of 3,000 sheep, but the guest cabins already by the 50s and 60s were no longer usable. For a while, Don Holson was listed as the mayor of Mad Creek Village. And in the late 1960s, the Holson family had a visitor, Mary Schwartz, who was Mary Heinze Schwartz, and she came and visited them and told them about how it was to drive the wagon down that other side into town to sell cream and to live up there. So the sale of the Mad Creek Ranch to the U.S. Forest Service was final in January of 1979, and the Holson family moved out of town. So that's what the house looked like when they rebuilt it, and then the Forest Service used it. So the last part of my story comes from Tom Ross's article that he wrote in the Steamboat Pilot and Today, and he titled his article, dated May 18th, 2007, Mad House to Come Down. Tom began his article, a small piece of U.S. Forest Service history will be erased from the landscape this summer when the old Mad Creek Guard Station is demolished. The house and later guard station that Holsons had rebuilt near the barn did not share the architectural charm and historic qualities of such places as Sea House, Summit, and Grizzly Creek guard stations, and was not deemed to qualify for historic preservation. I suppose that's true, kind of a mid-century building, but being like preservationists, we hate seeing anything come down, but that doesn't mean we're going to move up there and take care of it, I guess, either. During the 1960s, the house had been used for housing wilderness rangers and trail building crews. The Forest Service no longer had the money necessary to make it safe. And Tom wrote, the guard station at Mad Creek is emblematic of another era in Forest Service history when the district rangers and often their families lived in the modest buildings at the remote edges of the forest. The guard station was demolished in the summer of 2007. Tom Ross ended his article by writing, the guard station may go, but the rich history of the Mad Creek Valley will live on. And that's why we love the story. We like the rich history of the Mad Creek Valley.
During the summer and the fall, and then the family continued to still live there through the winter?
I'm not real sure they stayed there in the winter because, the Ives family had a place in St. Louis, and they must have also had a place in town because they had that creamery.
Oh, okay.
But Heinzie's, I think, lived there year-round.
Okay.
And so that was, and I'm sure that Ratliff must have lived there all the time. I'm not sure Heinzie's, or the Ives family that were in the middle. I don't think they lived there year-round. But the Pioneer did, and the Heinzie's did.
So we have no idea how, the main lodge, why that is just
no
longer.
But
all those little cabins, you can still see.
You can still see 3 cabins of the maybe 6 or 7.
Right.
And one is just a pile of wood, One is the cement foundation and an old stove that still sits in there. And then the third one is that picture that, you know, is partly coming down. But yeah, we can't find any trace or any other stories about, unless Candace knows, about that lodge.
The only thing I've found is spent a lot of time walking around as like a amateur archaeologist trying to find things. There is a stove in the area where we're looking at the lodge there. So it was incredibly heavy and made of iron. And so when the Forest Service demo, that was one thing that did not get called out. So when, if you're out there hiking around, you can go, like after you cross the creek off to the left in the field where you can see where this would be across the creek off to the left, you see the stove. There are some other things like some broken glass and different things like that, but there's been so much snow in the soil that it's hard to find that. I'm sure if there was an excavation.
So did the Forest Service build their little ranger station from out of the main cabin?
No, not that I know of. No, because the guard station would have been built long prior at the Mad Creek Farm. All of this was demoed in the probably 70s, 80s after they purchased the land. So 2 separate time periods.
Yeah.
So,
Anybody else have a question?
Over here,
Yes, sir?
first of all, I really enjoyed it.
Thank you.
But Mr. Heinzie came to Steamboat, one of 5 people with a car. That's pretty rare. What was he before he came to Steamboat?
Well, that's a good question. I don't know. I'm not sure, because when he came here, he did the mail, and I don't remember any other reference to him before he came, except that he came from the Denver Boulder area, and that's all I remember seeing.
I'm going to start passing some of this around. So this is the Mad Creek Guest Ranch brochure, which is, to
Yeah, that's a
me,
good question.
very
I really don't know.
exciting.
It'd be a good thing to know, you bet. Yeah, and we're definitely up for questions, but when we're done, yes, ma'am?
How on earth did they run a camp, a lodge, or whatever in the height of Great Depression?
I know.
Did you find anything about like guest size going way down, or them struggling, or, I mean, that just is
I'm not sure. It was specific to boys, and so they brought boys from Texas. They brought boys from St. Louis, and they must have brought them from Denver area. And then they did a lot of other local camps, you know, like some group from Steamboat, Panhellenic, or somebody would go up there too. We found evidence of that. But other than that, they had to be pretty self-sustaining, I think. They raised their own meat. They did their own garden. Definitely did their own roads. So yeah, they weren't too far from Clark, and they could get supplies, I'm sure, from Clark. But other than that, yeah, you had to go clear to Steamboat for a doctor. So yeah, I don't know. That's why it's so unfathomable, because it is so remote up there, and you're thinking, one of these that we're passing around has a little ad on there about how you get there. You can come by car, which, you know, in the early 1900s had to be quite an adventure anyway, coming over Rabbit Ears Road. You could come by train, you know, or you could maybe come by, I guess, horse.
So I'm not going to pass these around, but here are some of the objects that came from the Hindsie Homestead that were donated by Donna Hindsie Davis, that she
Yeah, we have
gave us that are in the collection now.
We have a quirt, we have a little pest trap, and then we have kind of a decorative bridal piece up here that were actually on the homestead, which is fun.
What's pretty amazing is when you're hiking, like, it's not a wide trail because of how the hillside has eroded into the trail. And so to think that they've got cars going up there with a 400-foot drop-off straight into a creek, it's unbelievable how
Well, and it
people-
did have a mudslide, what, 2 summers ago? There was a mudslide
Yeah.
up there. I don't know that we at least have not hiked it since the mudslide.
Right. And that's all stabilized now with the
Yeah. Any other questions?
These pictures really show how the rocks were all hand placed. And that's what you hike on. And that's what they drove on a really long time ago.
Yes,
How did the restoration of that barn really come about?
that was between 3 entities, Historic Route County, right? And had that in here somewhere. What did I say?
It was spearheaded by Historic Rock County, for the most part. It was a preservation project by Historic Rock
Yeah,
County.
so 3 different entities, but Historic Rock County in 2001, they took it on and made it all nice and new and shiny again and stable. So some of the pictures that we have are some of the joists and the way that they put the corners together, and then it's got a place inside that people will call, oh, it's the secret storage area, and you're thinking, it looks like a granary to me. I don't know how secret that is. But it's got little rooms, and it's just a cool old barn to walk around in. And you can still sit and walk around the foundation of the house. And it's just a fun area to be in, and to look at the fields, think about the cattle out there, and Forest Service, et cetera, et cetera. All right, you're welcome to stay as long as you would like to look at pictures. There's some more pictures up here in the books.